It's my privilege to be at the Panama Canal with Heritage Foundation President Dr. Kevin Roberts. Dr. Roberts, why is Heritage in Panama, and why are we standing at this canal?
That's a great question, Virginia. Well, you know, we travel the world some. Obviously, our focus is on American federal policy and state policy, but we travel the world some in order to get facts on the ground. And we tend to go to those spots that are really important for American national security. We've always done that, but that's especially important right now as President Trump and Vice President Vance, as you know, are placing the emphasis again on looking at foreign policy through the lens of the interests of the United States. Imagine that. And also, we like to spend time with allies, and Panama clearly is, and obviously the Panama Canal has been in the news. And so we had some really important meetings here that I bet you'll want to talk about, and what we do with that is make that the basis, or make those meetings the basis of the research that we do. So we have all of our policy scholars here as well.
That's critical. I want to get to those meetings, but I think it's probably helpful first if we just take a minute to touch on the history of the Panama Canal. The United States actually built the Panama Canal. It was completed in 1914, but in 1977, we signed a treaty with Panama saying, we're going to give this to you to have operational control of the Panama Canal. Why did President Carter decide to hand over control of the canal to the Panamanians?
I don't know how else to answer that question but to be blunt, because of his incompetence. And I think it's one of the most egregious decisions in the history of geopolitics since our country was founded. And I can say that and make a second point. The Panamanians have been great. I mean, obviously we've had some issues in Panama before, but the current administration, the party that is the political party that's in power, they are very allied with the United States, and for that matter, very allied with President Trump. The key thing about the Panama Canal is that the United States has also, at the same time that it got rid of its control, really been absent in this region. And you put those two things together, Virginia, the absence of the United States in this region, not having control of the Panama Canal, and what it has done is open an opportunity for our adversaries, particularly our greatest adversary, China, to step into that vacuum, and that, of course, is precisely what they've done.
Okay, so in regards to China, what is the role that China has on the Panama Canal and here in Panama? Because like you said, we've been hearing a lot in the news, and President Trump has said that he has concerns over China's influence in this region. What do we know? Well,
what we know is they have more control than they should. Most of that control comes in the form of economic interests, in investing companies and so on. And of course, the storefront, if you will, literally or figuratively, of a lot of these Chinese companies in Panama look like private businesses, but everything goes back to the top, not just to the CCP generally, but to Xi Jinping himself. But the second thing is, and this is a real concern for our colleague, our policy scholar, Wilson Beaver, himself a defense policy analyst, they're infringing upon American national security by building massive infrastructure here, a bridge here that the Panamanians love. We think it was a real mistake to trust the Chinese to do that, not the least of which is that the infrastructure is bad, it's poor quality, but also because the Chinese have really malign motivations in doing that. The United States, of course, given its absence in terms of our foreign policy, also a little bit in terms of our investment, has a real opportunity here amid that challenge, because the current president of Panama, President Mulino, I think can be a really rational partner, certainly for his country's interest, but also for ours.
Absolutely. You and some folks from the Heritage Foundation met with President Mulino and Panama's foreign minister yesterday. Do they recognize that China's influence in Panama is concerning and is a problem?
They recognize where we as Americans are coming from and where President Trump in particular is coming from, but I don't think that they apprehend fully how significant a problem it is in Panama and across Latin America. And that actually goes back to your first question, why we're here. Obviously, the Trump administration speaks for itself and does a very good job doing so, but sometimes it's helpful for heads of state in other countries to hear from people who are independent of any party, independent of any administration, even though we're, of course, ideologically aligned with President Trump. And we were able to convey to him and the foreign minister, both of whom are great public servants, that for the United States, especially for those of us who are conservatives, any country that does business with China is not a friend of the United States.
So tell me a little bit more about the meeting with the president. What were some of the other topics that were discussed apart from conversations around China? And moving forward, what does the relationship between Panama and the United States look like under the Trump administration?
High-level summary of the meeting is that President Mulino and I also talked about values. He's someone who is all of the above conservative, economic conservative, social conservative. He's very aligned with heritage, I would say. His foreign minister and the foreign minister's team are people who are familiar with our work. And so a lot of the conversation focused on the story to tell. And one of the things we've taken away from this trip, not just visiting Panama, but Paraguay and Argentina, is that our friends in Latin America simply don't tell the best part of their story to an American audience. And by that, this is what I mean. For the most part, they're making great decisions that, of course, benefit their people, but benefit Americans. And it's very hard for them to cut through some of the American media to tell that story. And I think if that happens, that can be really helpful. They have to do that on their own, obviously. That's not our job to do. But it's one of the things that I think could be a real benefit here, because if President Mulino and President Trump were to spend some time together, I bet they would actually get along. Both very successful businessmen, both really proud fathers and grandfathers. That comes across when you're in the presence of both of them. And while I can see some near-term challenges, and there are some near-term challenges in Panama, I also can see some real medium-term, long-term opportunities if President Mulino and his cabinet seize them.
And are most of those near-term challenges related to China, what we've spoken about?
I think so. There are others, but that's the preeminent one. And this is the bottom line. There are too many otherwise aligned policymakers, heads of state across Latin America with the United States who don't understand fully the threat that China is, not just to the United States, but to their own people. And if Heritage could wave a magic wand and get them to understand one thing, it would be that.
I want to chat just for a moment about immigration, because that's an issue that both President Mulino and Trump have been in agreement on, of saying, okay, we need to stop immigration through the Darien Gap and really crack down on this. Was that something that came up during the meeting with Mulino yesterday? And how can the U.S. and Panama continue to work together so that in the next administration, whoever our next president is, we don't go right back to the same situation in the Darien Gap with mass immigration flooding through?
Yes, after the topics of the canal in China, immigration and particularly the Darien Gap became the big focus. And there, President Mulino deserves an immense amount of credit. On his own accord, he's led the effort to make sure that there's been a dramatic reduction in crossings in the Darien Gap. Obviously, Trump policies have something to do with that in creating a disincentive. But one of the things we learned from this trip, Virginia, is that unless you have partners on the ground, in this case Panamanian forces, who are also implementing those policies, that you're not going to have you're not going to have the maximum effect of those Trump policies. So immigration is a huge concern. I'd give them an A+ on what they're doing to assist us. And that's precisely what I was referring to when I mentioned that there's common ground there. There's a real partnership that can be developed there. And perhaps what we can do as Americans is use that great work they've done on immigration to get to a better understanding of how the canal can operate.
Excellent. Well, Dr. Roberts, thank you. It's a privilege.
Thanks for being here.
Subscribe to get the news the legacy media won't tell you and only the Daily Signal can bring to you.